Is this just a fact of life?
How did we get into this mess?
Can you explain to me
Why were they so adamant?
What's the significance?
Estate.
A victim who cannot forgive, a kidnapper who cannot repent, a crisis which scarred the soul of Canada forever. It was called the October Crisis. 20 years ago, 2 political kidnappings led to the introduction of the War Measures Act and troops in the streets of Montreal. Tonight, James Cross, the diplomat held prisoner for 59 days, takes us back to the tiny room where he expected to die. His memories of that October have not faded. He refuses to meet his kidnapper, Jacques Langto, and as you'll see, Langto still believes that what he did to Cross served his cause.
Premier Robert Bourassa made the announcement of the call to the army.
Soldiers with submachine guns were stationed around the cathedral.
Hundreds of troops and police in the most massive operation in Montreal history.
The diplomat.
He came through pointing a gun at me and said, sort of backed me into the bedroom and said, "Get down on the floor or you'll be fucking dead."
There had been a report of a body in the trunk of a car in a parking lot in the central area of the city.
The revolutionary.
We want to make the revolution, and we don't want to kill nobody. This is a contradiction, of course.
How far would you go with that? How far would you extend that?
Well, just watch me.
The minister.
Well, I only wish we knew now, then what we know now. We didn't know.
James Cross can't forget. It's been 20 years since he's been on this street in Montreal. 20 years since he was a prisoner in this house.
The senior British Trade Commissioner in Montreal, James Richard Cross, is reported to have been kidnapped a short while ago from his Redpath Crescent home by as many as 4 armed men believed to be FLQ terrorists. Mr. Cross was forced at gunpoint to enter the waiting taxi and had sped away from the scene.
Now,
This is it.
this is it. This is the room which I spent 59 days. Naturally, it didn't look like this at the time.
Well, what did it look like then?
Well, there was a television set there in that corner.
Right here?
Yes, right there. Then there was the sort of table with a chair behind and a mattress here.
Are you telling me that you sat on a chair, you only ever looked at this corner in the 59 days that you lived in this room, you were never allowed to look behind you?
No, never. During the day,
5 terrorists guard him closely.
I had it on as a sort of hood, like this, so that I could only have that vision out there, you see, sort of 30-degree vision. Then at night, or when I was going to the bathroom, I had to pull it round like this so that it became a complete mask. And if, for example, I had to wash or anything and took the mask off, then they had a mask on themselves, so that I never saw their faces.
In radio communiques, the FLQ threatens to kill Cross unless the government releases imprisoned FLQ members, pays a ransom, and broadcasts the FLQ manifesto. Did you think that you were going to be killed? I mean, were you expecting to die when you came in this room?
By the time they read the manifesto with the demands, which was probably the afternoon of the first day, I think I said I must compose myself for death. I expected to die from then on, yes.
We knew that we wouldn't be able to kill James Cross like this.
Jacques Langto was the leader of the FLQ cell holding Cross. At 25, he was already an FLQ veteran.
In those years, the French Canadians were the poor, and the honor of the country was the English. And those of Westmount was a symbol of this richness that the French Canadians were not able to have.
You wanted to correct this injustice by violence.
Yes, perhaps by violence and by trying to wake up the people.
Langto sees his share of violence. FLQ bombs in the 1960s. Police beatings at nationalist demonstrations. Longto even appears on TV to protest police brutality. In early 1970, Longto is arrested for trying to kidnap an Israeli diplomat. He skips bail.
We were romantics. Huh? We were going to war, but we were not very prepared to. It was mostly romantic war.
What you're saying is that 20 years ago, you were just a bunch of nice kids, nice guys who just believed in a cause, and that you never would have hurt Mr. Cross. But kidnapping is a violent act.
We wanted to be a response, a violent response to the violence of the government, you know.
These are wholly unreasonable demands, and their authors could not have expected them to be accepted.
Mitchell Sharp is the minister on the hot seat.
This did come to me particularly as a great surprise, and to the cabinet, I can assure you.
But several months before the October crisis, this man warned the government that the FLQ was plotting kidnappings. John Starnes was the head of the RCMP security service at the time.
We said that we were talking about probably 10 units, 10 cells, and say 5 people in each cell. We're talking about 50 to 100 people at the most.
And you gave this information to cabinet?
Well, certainly it was given to various senior officers, and I'm assuming that cabinet ministers read it, and I assume it went to the Prime Minister's office.
It sounds as if no one read that report.
Well, I certainly hadn't read it, and as subsequent events were to show, we were very uncertain about the extent of what might be termed the conspiracy.
Saturday, October 10th. 5 days after Longto kidnaps Cross, a second FLQ cell grabs Pierre Laporte, a Quebec cabinet minister. Panic spreads.
Have a good effect on the negotiations between the government and the FLQ.
I'm sorry, there are too many questions there.
The government of a very young Robert Bourassa is under fire.
That the police forces were not sufficient.
Thursday, October 15th, Quebec asks Ottawa to send in the troops to help the police. Montreal is a city under siege.
Nous vaincrons!
That night, students rally to support the FLQ. What they don't know is that police have already drawn up lists of hundreds of people to arrest, that Ottawa is ready to declare virtual martial law in Quebec. For now, these are the images filling TV screens.
It did seem to the viewer that, you know, a whole group of people were taking the streets to take over. I mean, if I had been in any position of power at that time, I would have been worried about revolution in the streets.
Have you seen those pictures that carry you back 20 years as to the atmosphere? The great public meetings in support of the FLQ?
The rallies in support of the FLQ frightened the bejesus out of the cabinet. Don't you think you overreacted?
Well, maybe. Maybe.
The powers include the right to search and arrest without warrant, to detain suspected persons without the necessity of laying specific charges immediately, and to detain persons without bail.
Friday, October 16th, 4 a.m. Cabinet declares the War Measures Act, claiming an apprehended insurrection exists in Quebec. Police arrest over 400 Quebecers. Only a handful will ever be charged. It is a night that scars Quebec for years. And the next day, the October crisis becomes even more tragic.
Is that confirmed, though? I mean, he's dead where? Dead where?
James Cross watches this scene with horror from his tiny room.
Here is a special report from the Montreal newsroom of the CBC. Pierre Laporte, the Minister of Labor and Immigration, was found tonight in the trunk of a car near St. Hubert Airport on the South Shore opposite Montreal. Provincial police now report, too, that James Cross, the 49-year-old British Trade Commissioner in Montreal, abducted from his home 13 days ago, has also been found dead.
And of course I was afraid, and my wife was still up watching it, and you know, I sort of wanted to sort of jump up and scream, you know, I'm not dead, I'm alive. And finally, I think even my kidnappers took some pity on me, and they gave me a sleeping pill and one hostage killed. Why not the other?
So you felt that at any moment you could...
At any moment, I could be the next, yes.
Well, what was your personal reaction when you heard that news on the television that Laporte had been murdered? How did...
I was shocked. I was consterné. It was a big, big mistake.
You shrug this off as a tactical error. Have you no sense at all that this was a human being?
I would cry for Pierre Laporte if I would have been with him, and I would have see him dying, because I will have known him better. But my first reaction was I was shocked, I was consterné, and I thought this was a political error.
The man is dead, and you say it's a technical mistake. I mean, what sort of a human being is this? I mean, you know, to think of what Levesque said that night. And somebody was trying to ask him what he thought of it. He said, "Fuck you, a man's dead. Can't you realize that?"
Laporte's murder shocks the country. Whatever sympathy there is in Quebec for the FLQ quickly evaporates. Thanks to the War Measures Act, there are now no more rallies, no more protests. Police raid over 22,000 homes, question 35,000 people. They fail to find any evidence of an insurrection. RCMP headquarters in Montreal, Friday, October 23rd. It's 1 week after the War Measures Act is declared. Cabinet sends the Deputy Solicitor General to meet with top police officials here. According to secret government minutes, he tells them the problem facing Cabinet was a grave one. There was no concrete evidence, which led to invoking the War Measures Act.
It wasn't an actual insurrection, it was an apprehended one. It was concern about, we didn't know exactly how far it went.
But the dramatic suspension of civil liberties seems horrendous when you didn't have the evidence.
Because we didn't have the evidence. If we had had that evidence, we wouldn't have invoked the War Measures Act. There was a crisis atmosphere, and whether the action taken was excessive or not, it certainly ended the crisis.
So that was the real purpose, to calm people down?
Yes.
And to show them that the government was in control?
Yes. Yeah. You remember what Trudeau said. There's only one government in this country.
Were you yourself relieved when you heard that the War Measures Act had been proclaimed?
Well, if it did anything to get me out of there, I was delighted.
It certainly is a subject today of great debate.
That's, as I've said before on other matters, that is a subject for you Canadians to solve. Don't ask me to solve. Don't ask me to be your conscience.
Friday, December 4th. After 59 days, police finally discover where Langto is hiding Cross. The government and the FLQ strike a deal. James Cross goes free, and Jacques Langto and his fellow kidnappers board a government plane to Cuba. 8 years later, Langto returns to Quebec to stand trial, unrepentant. His sentence, 3 years in jail. Langto is out in 2 years. Today, Langto lives with his family in Outremont, a fashionable district of Montreal. He has become a successful book publisher. This fall, he's even putting out a book on the FLQ. Langto's company gets over $100,000 a year in grants from the federal government. You have a chance now. You're appearing on the same show as James Cross. What would you say to him now?
Well, I would say hello, but...
You wouldn't say, "I'm sorry"?
No. No.
I think the hardest thing for Canadians to understand is why you can't say to James Cross, "I'm sorry."
No, because for me, like I told you, it was part of the game. Perhaps we have been violent because we kidnapped him, but we didn't use violence against this person.
So what I want to ask you is if you would forgive him.
Never. Why should I? What he did to me and my family.
So there is still in your heart, you.
Of course. I mean, this rocked our lives. My wife suffered the most appalling period. Can you imagine what the suffering is to wake up, not wake up every morning and not know what's happened to somebody. It's the most appalling brutality to impose on people.
2 decades after the October crisis, 2 men are still consumed by the passions of the time. Jacques Langto feels in the end he won, because public support for Quebec independence is now at an all-time high.
I think Quebec win, because we looked at the Parti Québécois took the power six years after, and the idea of independence has make his way on, and I think nobody in Quebec is ashamed of me.
And Christianity says something about forgiving sinners, but I'm not sure that I'm a very good Christian. I'm not in the business of saying who won or who lost. But Pierre Laporte has been lying up on that mountain in Montreal for the last 20 years. That's something to think about.
James Cross can't forget. It's been 20 years since he's been on this street in Montreal. 20 years since he was a prisoner in this house.
I think I said I must compose myself for death. I expected to die from then on, yes.
We knew that we wouldn't be able to kill James Cross like this.